Martha Hale believed she was invisible, and for 3 years that invisibility protected her. While the world forgot Arthur Bennett, she became the quiet force holding his life together, managing his decline one day at a time. No one paid attention to her steady presence. Not the neighbors, not the relatives, not the people who would later fight over his fortune. But the moment Arthur Bennett died, Martha Hale's name exploded into court files, headlines, and accusations. Overnight, she transformed from an unnoticed caregiver into the center of a $2.5 million war, where loyalty was questioned, blood was weaponized, and every step she had taken inside his house was suddenly put on trial. The woman entered his life quietly, without attention or ceremony, at a point when his world had already begun to shrink. Age had slowed his body, illness had weakened his strength, and the once busy house now echoed with long hours of silence. He had lived there for decades, surrounded by objects that carried memories, but very few people remained to share them. His days followed a fragile routine shaped by medication schedules, limited movement, and frequent exhaustion. That was when the caregiver was assigned to him, introduced as a practical solution rather than a lasting presence. At first, her responsibilities were simple and strictly professional. She assisted with basic tasks, monitored his condition, and ensured his needs were met according to instructions left by doctors and family members. She did not interfere with his personal affairs or question decisions. Neighbors occasionally noticed her arriving early in the morning and leaving after sunset, always moving with purpose. Nothing about her behavior suggested ambition or expectation beyond her role. As weeks passed, the man's reliance on her grew naturally. His health required more attention, and fewer relatives appeared to offer support. Visits from family became shorter and less frequent, often delayed or canceled entirely. The caregiver filled the gaps without comment. She kept the house running, organized medications, prepared meals, and ensured medical appointments were not missed. The home slowly regained structure, even as his body continued to weaken. Security cameras installed around the property captured this quiet transformation. Day after day, the footage showed the same figure unlocking the door, adjusting curtains, and moving through the house with familiarity. There were no signs of conflict or manipulation, only consistency. At this early stage, no one could have predicted how deeply her presence would alter the course of his final years. Time moved differently inside the house as the months stretched into years. The man's condition continued to decline, not suddenly, but in small, steady ways that required constant attention. Simple tasks became difficult, and moments of strength grew rare. During this period, the caregiver's presence became essential rather than optional. She adjusted her schedule to match his needs, often staying beyond her assigned hours when his health demanded it. The routine they followed became predictable, built around care rather than convenience. Family members appeared less often as time passed. Holidays came and went with brief visits or none at all. Phone calls replaced physical presence, and even those became irregular. The caregiver remained, filling the empty spaces left behind. She handled transportation to medical appointments, kept detailed records of medications, and ensured the household remained functional. Bills were paid on time, supplies were stocked, and the man's environment stayed calm and orderly. These responsibilities were taken on gradually, without formal announcements or demands. Security footage from this period later revealed a clear pattern. The caregiver was seen entering the property nearly every day, sometimes multiple times. She arrived early, left late, and returned when needed. The man's relatives, in contrast, appeared rarely on the recordings, their visits brief and infrequent. The cameras did not capture moments of drama or confrontation, only repetition and commitment. Financial records showed nothing unusual during these years. Her payments remained consistent with her role, and no unexplained transactions occurred. Medical notes confirmed the man's condition required increasing levels of care, all of which were being met. What stood out was not excess, but stability. The caregiver had become the one constant in a life that was otherwise fading. The change began quietly, without announcement or warning, hidden within ordinary paperwork and routine decisions. As his health worsened, the man became increasingly aware of how limited his time was. Medical assessments showed his mind remained clear even as his body failed him. During this period, he started reviewing documents he had not touched in years, including financial records, property deeds, and estate plans that had been prepared long before his condition declined. These papers reflected a past life, one that assumed family would always be present. The caregiver was not involved in these decisions, nor did she initiate any conversations about inheritance or money. Records later showed that the man contacted legal professionals on his own, requesting updates to his will. Appointments were scheduled privately, and the process followed standard procedures. Witnesses confirmed he was calm, aware, and deliberate. There were no signs of pressure or confusion during these steps, and no evidence suggested anyone influenced the outcome. When he updated what was finalized, its contents were unexpected. The majority of his assets, totaling approximately $2.5 million, were reassigned to the caregiver. This included savings, investments, and partial ownership of the home. Smaller portions were left to family members, but the shift in priority was unmistakable. The documents clearly stated his reasoning, emphasizing gratitude, loyalty, and consistent care during years of isolation. The change remained unknown until after his death. Life in the house continued as it had before, guided by routine and declining health. The caregiver continued her duties without any visible change in behavior or expectation. She did not alter her lifestyle, request additional compensation, or display awareness of what had been arranged. It was only after the man passed away that the truth emerged. Legal notifications were sent, and the will was read. The reaction was immediate and intense once the contents of the will became known. Family members who had remained distant for years suddenly reappeared, united by shock and disbelief. The decision made by the man was described as impossible, unnatural, and unfair. Within days, legal action was initiated to challenge the validity of the will. The caregiver's name became the focus of every complaint, suspicion, and accusation filed in court. Efforts were made to question her character and intentions. Her employment history was examined, her finances scrutinized, and her time in the household reframed as something calculated rather than devoted. Stories began circulating that suggested manipulation, emotional influence, and exploitation of a vulnerable man. None of these claims were supported by evidence, yet they spread quickly, shaping public perception before facts could be reviewed. The family took physical control of the estate. Locks were changed, access codes were reset, and the caregiver was barred from entering the home she had maintained for years. Personal items belonging to her were removed without notice. Documents and records she had kept were seized, limiting her ability to defend herself. In a matter of days, her presence was erased from the property as though she had never played a role in the man's life. Formal complaints followed, accusing her of undue influence and financial misconduct. Emergency court filings sought to freeze assets and delay any transfer of inheritance. The family argued that blood ties outweighed any form of service, regardless of duration or dedication. The case shifted from a private estate matter into a hostile legal battle. What was missing from their arguments was proof. Despite the intensity of their response, no concrete evidence surfaced to support the accusations. The caregiver remained silent, relying on records rather than emotion, while the family attempted to rewrite history. As the legal battle escalated, investigators began assembling a timeline that relied less on accusation and more on verifiable facts. One of the most critical sources of information came from the security system installed throughout the property. The cameras had been placed years earlier for safety, never intended to serve as witnesses in a courtroom. Yet they had quietly recorded daily life without bias, capturing movements, patterns, and absences with precise accuracy. When the footage was reviewed, a clear routine emerged. The caregiver appeared consistently, often early in the morning and late at night. Days passed without interruption in her presence. The recordings showed her performing ordinary tasks that matched medical logs and household records. There were no secret meetings, no signs of coercion, and no unusual interactions. Her behavior remained steady regardless of the man's condition or financial matters. In contrast, the family's presence was minimal. Weeks and sometimes months passed without a single appearance captured on camera. When they did visit, their time in the house was brief. The footage documented arrivals and departures that contradicted their claims of frequent involvement. These visual records quietly dismantled the narrative being pushed in court filings and public statements. The most important detail was what the cameras did not show. There were no moments where the caregiver restricted access to the man, interfered with visitors, or isolated him from others. Doors opened freely, and the environment remained calm. The man was never seen distressed or confused during interactions with her. As segments of the footage were cataloged and time-stamped, the case began to shift. Objective evidence replaced emotional arguments. The recordings did not speak in words, but they revealed truth through consistency. What had been dismissed as routine caregiving now stood as documented proof, and the family's attempt to erase her role began. Beyond the security footage, investigators turned their attention to written records that could confirm or contradict what the camera suggested. Financial statements were examined first, covering several years before the man's death. Every transaction was reviewed carefully, looking for sudden withdrawals, unusual transfers, or unexplained gifts. The results were consistent and uneventful. Payments made to the caregiver matched her agreed compensation and showed no signs of manipulation or secret enrichment. Medical documentation provided further clarity. Doctors' notes confirmed that the man remained mentally capable when major decisions were made. Cognitive assessments showed stable awareness, clear judgment, and no diagnosis that would have affected his ability to understand legal matters. Appointment logs demonstrated that the caregiver followed medical instructions precisely, ensuring treatments and medications were administered correctly. There was no evidence of neglect or interference. Handwritten notes found among the man's personal belongings offered another layer of insight. These writings, dated and organized, reflected gratitude and careful thought rather than confusion. He documented expenses, reminders, and future plans in steady handwriting. None of the notes mentioned pressure, fear, or doubt. Instead, they reflected appreciation for reliability during a time when he felt increasingly abandoned by those he expected to rely on. Legal professionals involved in the will revision submitted sworn statements. They confirmed the man requested changes independently and understood the consequences of his decisions. The caregiver was not present during consultations, and no irregularities were reported. Standard legal safeguards have been followed at every step. Together, these documents formed a clear and consistent record. Each piece supported the same conclusion drawn from the footage. The narrative of manipulation could not survive against timelines. As evidence continued to surface, the effort to remove the caregiver from the story began to collapse. Media attention grew once court documents became public and analysts started questioning the family's version of events. Reports highlighted the contrast between years of documented caregiving and the relative's long absences. What had once been framed as suspicious behavior now appeared to be commitment under difficult circumstances. Public opinion shifted steadily. Commentators discussed how isolation affects the elderly and how dependence often forms naturally with those who provide daily care. The case sparked wider conversations about loyalty, responsibility, and the meaning of family beyond bloodlines. The caregiver, previously described as an intruder, was increasingly seen as a stabilizing presence in the man's final years. The family's actions were examined more closely. Their sudden involvement after the man's death raised questions about motivation. Legal experts pointed out that challenges based solely on inheritance expectations rarely succeed without evidence of wrongdoing. Each failed attempt to discredit the caregiver further weakened their position and strengthened hers. The narrative changed from one of alleged exploitation to one of abandonment. Records showed extended periods where the man had no visitors other than the caregiver. Medical needs were met consistently, while emotional support came from the same source. This contrast was difficult to ignore and even harder to dismiss. Attempts to suppress information failed. CCTV clips, timelines, and documents continued circulating, reinforcing a consistent story. The family's claim that they had been pushed aside was contradicted by their own absence. Their strategy, built on erasure and accusation, unraveled as facts accumulated. By this stage, the case no longer belonged solely to the courtroom. It had become a broader reflection on how society values care versus entitlement. The final ruling brought an end to a conflict that had stretched far beyond money. After reviewing all evidence, the court upheld the will exactly as it had been written. The decision was based not on sympathy or opinion, but on documented facts that showed clear intent, mental capacity, and lawful process. The caregiver's inheritance was confirmed, and the family's challenges were formally dismissed. What had once seemed unthinkable was now legally undeniable. The outcome carried consequences beyond the transfer of assets. The family retained their name and public identity, but their version of events collapsed under scrutiny. Their absence during the man's final years was preserved in records that could not be undone. Attempts to erase the caregiver only strengthened the proof of her presence. Time, it turned out, was the most reliable witness. The caregiver did not celebrate publicly or seek attention. Financial gain did not erase the emotional toll of being questioned, isolated, and accused. Yet the ruling restored something more valuable than wealth: acknowledgement. Her role was officially recognized, not as manipulation, but as commitment carried out quietly over years. The man's final decision became the lasting message of the case. He had measured loyalty not by sheer blood, but by consistency during vulnerability. His wealth followed the person who showed up when others did not. The inheritance was no longer just money. It became a statement about value, care, and choice. As the story faded from headlines, it remained as a cautionary tale. It exposed how easily caregivers can be dismissed and how quickly absence can be forgotten until consequences appear. In the end, the truth endured through evidence, patience, and time. What could not be erased was the simple reality that presence, once proven, outweighs every attempt to rewrite the past.